Hi, so just gonna have a look now at this Blade Boss and swing blades. As you can see, it's nice, all the rust is gone. I've coated it in cold gal zinc and it's looking really nice now. The blades are reconditioned. Let's also have a look underneath the deck. I removed the rust and also did the same thing. I coated it in cold gal zinc to prevent any further rust. What I'm going to do now is put the blades back on and we'll see what else we can find out. So, pulled off all that plastic and painter's tape. It's good to experiment like I've done. This is sort of the first time I've tried to repaint a mower deck while leaving the engine and the wheels on. So it was a unique experiment because I wanted to know how much overspray there would be on certain things. So you can see up here, there's the spots, because I taped this up, the spots I couldn't paint properly. I'll have to sort of touch that up. This stuff you can see on the surface, that's just on the surface. I'll spray that off with the air compressor. Overall it worked out okay. The original label doesn't look too bad, too shabby. The paint, it's not perfect. It'll look better once I give it a little bit of a spray. But there's a little bit of overspray just here. That's not going to really bother anyone. As you can see here, there's a bit of overspray there. That's not going to really bother anyone unless you're quite particular. Let's have a look over here. But I think overall, it's not too bad for a mower that I didn't actually take the engine and wheels off. It's going to look a lot nicer. So I'm just going to give it a spray down with the air compressor. So I've put the handle back on. That had a coat of paint as well. As you can see, the bolts are not painted, and this little metal plate that covers, The paint, because I was painting in really bad lighting, it was hard to see whether I had a good coat or not, but that's okay. It's not going to affect anything, it's just the primer you can see through there. Alright, there we go. Unfortunately, I took off a little bit of paint here and there. I could probably touch that up before I'm finished, but the spring is back on. That's a little bit difficult. My advice, if after doing it, put this part on first in the deck, and then it's easy to pull it up and put it onto here. I was trying to put this on first and then connect that. Wrong way to do it. So here is the fuel tank after painting. It's not perfect. Sorry about that. It's not perfect, but it doesn't even really need to be painted. I just did it just because I was painting everything else. Obviously you want this surface where the carburetor fits to be nice and clean. I didn't paint the fuel tank lid because the paint would just come straight off that, and I didn't paint these labels. Okay. In hindsight, I think with the paint, it needs a long time to dry. This has been drying for a long time, like a good couple of days, and it's still a bit wet, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to put the carby back on and then think about putting that back onto the engine itself. Memory serves me, we put the diaphragm on first. Those 5 screws back in. When you start it off, you'll see that I dropped them in and just sort of do it up finger tight, and then when I'm tightening it, I sort of change sides every time I tighten it to get like a nice even force going down onto the fuel tank. Okay, somewhere along the way, while pulling this apart, there's a little O-ring that belongs in there, and from memory this little plastic ring sits on top of it. I probably lost it and vacuumed it up, so I have to replace the O-ring or it's going to be losing compression, losing air through there. I did keep this gasket that sits on top of here. That's salvageable. I'm going to have to put something in here just to make sure it's a nice seal underneath this. So I picked up this from Super Cheap Auto. It's this real cheap O-ring assortment set for about $11, and hopefully we can find some O-rings in here that'll will fit into this carby. Too big. Okay, that fits nice. There's a bit of a gap there. I might put another one in Just okay, so I don't know if you can see in there with those two little rings, makes a nice seal. So I shouldn't have to worry about that anymore. That's quite convenient. Just a quick one. Now with these Briggs and Stratton engines, most of the bolts and fittings are in Imperial because they're made in the United States. So a lot of the things that you can unscrew will either be 1/2 inch or 3/8. The equivalent metric would be, I think, 1/2 inch would be 13 mil and 3/8 would be 10 mil. Sometimes you do get that, but most of the time it's in Imperial 1/2 inch and 3/8. So I've just put the carby back on. When you're doing this, just make sure that you line this tube up first, because I had to undo those bolts and then realign it. I guess the biggest thing with these carbies is this spring setup. This sort of can make people avoid doing this. Even myself, I used to not wanting to touch this. So this here acts as the governor, so that the engine can idle. This is the correct way to set up the springs. So right now it's at full throttle, and if I ease it back, when it is running, this will allow this to come out a bit more. So you want to make sure that these springs are attached to that loop, and the loop, the short end is towards the engine. This here, this tab, you can see this is bent forward. You can bend it forward to adjust the idle. So if I put it back together and it's idling too fast, I can push this back a little bit and it might help. This is the new air filter. This is the air filter housing that I cleaned up. It's not perfect, but you can see the new air filter goes in there quite nicely. Let's just grab this. Now, it certainly looks the part. So here's the recoil cover, all painted up, and the labels are still there. Looks much better than it used to. Also the rust is gone, so that's nice. And put that back on. Alright, so that's the recoil cover back on. Pretty straightforward, 3 bolts. I was starting to look like a mower again. So I've got some oil prepared for the engine, as earlier I drained it. This is the oil that I use. I just get this from Bunnings. It's pretty cheap, 4-stroke 10W30 semi-synthetic oil. I've used it before. Seems pretty good, made in America. Most mowers, like common Briggs & Stratton and Honda mowers, typically take around 600 mils. So I just measured out 500 mils to the line here and then used a small measuring cup to get an extra 100 mils. I'm not going to pour it all in one go. I'm going to pour in most of it and then check the dipstick and see how that looks. Alright, so that's probably about 450 mils I put in. I might just check the dipstick. It is important to try to get a fairly, I suppose, accurate amount. You don't really want the oil to go beyond this arrow. So it's definitely, in my opinion, enough oil. Good thing I didn't put it all in. So yeah, I'd say that's enough oil. It's not always easy to get all the residual old oil out unless you drop the bottom sump plug, which, unless you're doing a full engine rebuild, most people don't really worry about that. So it runs after I put it back together. Couple of little adjustments to the idle, and still working on the throttle cable. The throttle cable is a bit of an issue. There was a little bit of a sort of a puff going on, you can probably hear, and there's some smoke coming from the exhaust. That's probably just too much oil, to be honest, in there. I hope I don't have to take any oil out, but I might have a look at this exhaust and see if it's in good order. So taking the exhaust off, and there's a lot of muck and stuff in there. I don't think it's explaining why it's sort of backfiring a little bit, but I can clean this out and have a look. So a little mucking around and swearing and getting angry in the shed, I finally have got this throttle and spring set up to work. I was having some issues with the idle and I had to adjust this little tab back a little bit. It was idling too fast. This spring, I've had to modify this. It's an old worn out spring, so I just had to cut a little bit off it and reattach it. But the big issue was the throttle cable. You notice this looks different. I've had to steal this off an old mower that I've got sitting somewhere else in parts. The old throttle cable, it was just too stretched, and the big problem is when I tried to lower the revs, it would not lower them enough to actually hit the kill switch and turn the mower off, which was a big issue. So I took this throttle cable from the other mower. I literally just cleaned it up, attached it, started it, and the main thing, I had to just get this adjusted at the right spot. This is fairly tight, and it needed to be tight to give it enough tension to push the mower so I could turn it off, push the throttle cable to turn it off. Next, I'm just going to put the air cleaner on top, and we're going to be pretty close to finishing, apart from a couple of little touch-ups here and there. So just before I put the air filter back on, I have this in the shed and I've used it before. Some people say that you shouldn't use it. It's foam filter oil. I use it on new filters, but very, very sparingly. You'll notice the colour of the filter now is like a green colour. I didn't use much at all, much of this oil at all on it. So I squeezed out any excess, and the reason I put this on is it basically helps to filter out all the really super fine particles, and the filter will last longer. So I'm just going to put this back on now. A lot of people, they put them on the wrong way around. They think that the pointy end goes forward. That's actually incorrect. So goes on, it's probably best to put the screw in first. Goes on straight up like this, with the flat end facing forward. Okay, you don't want to screw that on too tight because you are screwing into like a hardened plastic, but it should be tight enough that it's not going to rattle at all, and it's a nice tight fit. So I know it seems a bit pedantic, but I might just touch up some of this paint that's scuffed up or had a little bit of black go onto it. This back flap, I might give that a wipe down with grease remover, and then we should be finished, and I'll do a final startup. Finally finished the mower, put it back together, touched up a little bit of paint here and there that just sort of came off during reassembly. I'll show them. It's kind of shiny now. It's not perfect, it was never intended to be perfect, but I think it's a million times better than it was. Nice and clean. I cleaned up this catcher, believe it or not, just with a bit of tyre shine, a bit of tyre black spray. So I didn't paint that. Different throttle that I had to put on to get it running properly. I did the same thing with the tyres or wheels. I put black tyre shine on them. So she runs, first pull, didn't even have to pull it very hard. The engine probably isn't running perfectly smooth. You could probably hear there's something in the timing, maybe slightly out. But otherwise, I'm happy with it. It's going to be a good mower, and I've actually got a bloke coming down from the Tablelands, said he's interested in buying it. We'll see if he likes it, and we'll see if it goes. So I sold the mower that I was fixing up for 10 times the price that I paid for it. So if you're curious about what I paid for it, maybe go back and look at video 1, part 1. I'm really happy. It wasn't like the best restoration of a mower, but I think I was able to learn a few new things, refine some skills. I'll be doing future videos on fixing up more Briggs & Stratton style mowers, and hopefully I'll dive into some new things on those. So tune in, keep watching the videos, and if you haven't already watched part 1 and part 2, go back and look at them. And thanks for tuning in. See you next time.